Everyone here on the East Coast, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast in Hawaii and Alaska. Before we start today's webinar, at the beginning, I want to call your attention to a development that occurred recently where the United States Treasury has issued a proposal for financial regulatory reform, which is subtitled Rebuilding Financial Supervision and Regulation, and which calls for a, quote, more robust application of the Community Reinvestment Act, and simultaneously calls for establishing a new agency which would take the responsibility for CRA examinations away from the 4 regulatory agencies. Implicit in this proposal is not only a more aggressive enforcement of this Community Reinvestment Act, but also a criticism of the agency's examinations as being too lax. Only a year ago, Barney Frank, of the United States Congress and chairman of the Banks Committee, expressed skepticism about the very low failure rate for banks and CRA performance evaluations. So don't be surprised if you find a much more critical examination of your CRA performance in your upcoming exams. The regulators, too, read the political tea leaves, and they know which way the wind is blowing. Now, getting ready for your CRA exam is more than just having your files in order, although that's a great start. Proper preparation means anticipating examiner questions and having your answers ready before they're even asked. This in turn means that you not only should be collecting and organizing your data, it means that you should be studying and analyzing your performance before the examiners arrive. You should really rate your performance and tell the examiners how you are performing and not the other way around. Now, the goals that we have today for getting ready for your CRA exam and having a winning CRA exam strategy is, of course, number one, be organized and prepared. And we're going to try to give you some direction on how to get better organized and prepared for your exam. But there's a second goal that you should have in mind, and that is to win over the confidence of the examiners. To show them that what the data that you're giving them and the information you're giving them is complete and accurate and reliable, so that their evaluation of your performance is going to be based on accurate information and not incorrect or incomplete information. Of course, the third goal of today and of your CRA exam preparation is to pass your exam, and to pass it as quickly and easily as possible. So, with that in mind, I want to go over quickly what it is we're going to be discussing specifically today. First, we're going to discuss the CRA quote process. Then we're going to go and examine the public file requirements. Following that, we will be talking about data preparation and data integrity. Then we'll go into examination standards for different size banks, what it is the examiners will be looking at based on your bank size. We'll talk then about the CRA test and distinguish the test from the performance standards. You have to know both what the tests are going to be, and you have to know and understand what standards apply to your bank. Then we'll talk about the performance context and performance context data and how important it is to have not only information about your own bank's numbers and results, but about the performance context itself. We'll also briefly discuss board and management oversight responsibilities, a critical element for compliance of any sort at all, but particularly so for CRA and your CRA performance. And while doing this, we're going to integrate some best practices suggestions for each of these topic areas. At the end of this presentation, if time permits, we'll allow you to send in your questions, and you can do so even while I'm speaking into the questions box, as Kate was explaining to you a few minutes ago. Now, I want to begin by discussing with you the CRA process. And what I mean by process is I mean the systems and procedures that you have in place to collect the necessary data for CRA and to monitor it and manage it. Now, this may surprise you. Why am I talking about this first thing? This is, after all, about something you should have been doing all along for the last few years, and why talk about it now? In fact, it's a topic about very little of which is said, but nonetheless, it is one of the primary issues in regulatory examinations today because no examination is more reliable than the data on which it's predicated. And that, in turn, depends on your process. So since examiners know that data integrity is dependent on process, in other words, the systems and procedures that you've got in place to assure that data is collected, coded, and compiled accurately, they do look at the systems and procedures that you have in place. And even though you don't specifically get rated on that, it becomes an important part of your exam process. So I believe that CRA examination preparation begins with understanding the importance of your CRA process, what is included in the process, and what are the best process practices. And I can't emphasize this enough, doing everything you can do to show examiners that you have a process that creates reliable data on which they can predicate their evaluation of your performance. This is huge, and it's not required. When you get your examination letter, they don't ask you to provide this information, but it's something that it's really important for you to do. You need to establish credibility with your examination team right off the bat. In my opinion, that's the first and most basic step in getting ready for your exam. So that means you've got to review the process, and you've got to be able to explain and show to the examiners, even if they don't ask for it, show them what you're doing to assure the reliability and integrity of your data. Now, specifically, what do they mean when they talk about CRA and the processes? Well, they talk about basically 4 basic elements. Number 1 is data collection and reporting. Number 2 is data monitoring. Managing your performance is important. In other words, it's not just collecting the information. CRA is not just a passive process. It's an active process of monitoring and managing the results. You know the old saying about 3 kinds of people in the world. There's people who make things happen, there's people who watch what happens, and there's people who wonder what happened. Well, too many situations involve bankers who fall into the latter category. They not only don't make things happen, they don't understand exactly what did happen when they fail their CRA exam. You've got to be in that first category. You have to understand that passing a CRA exam is something you should be proactive about, and it's something you can control. It's not something that poor little OU can't do anything about, but you need to have a game plan in place to pass your CRA exam. And that begins by looking at the CRA process. So data monitoring is the second thing. The third thing is personnel training. No process is any more reliable than the people who are involved in implementing the systems and procedures. So you could have a perfect process laid out, but if the people who are employed to implement that process are not properly trained, you are going to have still big problems. Finally, the fourth and critical element of the CRA process is board oversight, showing the examiners that your board actually monitors and manages your CRA process and is involved in it. So those are the 4 critical elements in the CRA process. And it's very critical that you show examiners and establish this right up front, that you've got a good process that's in place that they can rely on. Now, what are the best practices with respect to CRA process? Well, first of all, you should have a simple set of written procedures to collect and code the data. Now, before all of you have a heart attack, I want to explain to you, this does not have to be a 100-page manual. In fact, in most cases, a simple 2 or 3 page document can do that. That just explains how data is collected, how it's entered into your system, who's responsible for doing that, etc. If you haven't done that, I strongly recommend that you make it a high priority as you prepare for your imminent CRA exam. Just having that document that shows examiners what your steps are in entering and collecting data goes a long way towards engendering the confidence that you want them to have in your process. So I would make it one of the top priorities as you get prepared for your exam. If you haven't got something in writing already, develop it now before the examiners show up. If you already have something in place, then I would urge you just to review it and to make certain that it's up to date, that it's accurate, and I can't overemphasize this, that it really is being followed or adhered to, because it won't do you any good to have a beautiful set of procedures in place if no one's following them. So you want to make certain that people are doing that as well. If you were to hand over to an examiner, here's our 10 steps that we have to collect and monitor our data, and then they go and talk to people in your bank who are involved in the process, and it turns out they're not doing it, you've lost all the credibility you started when you presented the document to them. So, number one, best practice, make certain that you have a simple set of written procedures pertaining to collection and monitoring of data. Number two, make certain that people are trained and the training is documented. Everyone should be trained regarding the Community Reinvestment Act at least once every 3 years, because the act and its implementation has changed over time. Not only did we had new Q&As that were issued in 2005, which had a dramatic impact on how the regulation's been implemented by the regulators. And then again, at the beginning of this year, there was an entirely new set of questions and answers that were issued on January 6th of 2009, again, which had some very, very significant implications. So you want to make certain that you can show and document to the examiners that everyone involved in CRA has periodic training and the training is up to date. Simple thing, just have a folder, have something that shows any training you've gone to, a webinar by GeoDataVision or put out by the ABA, whatever it is, show them, retain the training materials, retain a list of who went to the training, and any other documentation to show examiners that you're serious about your CRA commitment and making certain that people are educated and informed about CRA. Number three, you want to make certain that you have a CRA committee in place that has periodic meetings. I recommend at least semi-annual and preferably quarterly meetings, because it's not enough just to collect the information. That's a great start, and make certain you have reliable information. But it's also important to show that the bank actually manages and monitors its CRA performance. And this normally is done and should be done with a CRA committee that has members of management in it, and maybe ideally even one board member as well. But basically this shows that the commitment on the part of the bank and on the part of management and the board to exercising the CRA responsibilities that are imposed on the bank. It's proactive management of the process. You also should have any internal audit or reviews, the results documented in a folder, and show it to the examiners. Even if they don't ask it, say, look, we are committed to having good, solid, reliable data, and we also make certain we do our best efforts to make certain that data is accurate and reliable. We have an internal audit procedure, we have an internal review procedure, whatever it is you want to call it, that shows that you're actually testing the records and doing some verification, and when problems are identified, you're doing something about it. You're correcting these things. It's not, by the way, embarrassing or bad to show them that you have problems. In fact, it can be a good thing, because all examiners know that no one's infallible. Mistakes are going to occur. So when the question is, do you have a process in place to identify the mistakes, and then what do you do about them when they are identified? If you can show them that you have such a procedure in place, boy, will you enhance your credibility. And most of you, I would assume, would just as soon get the exam over with as quickly as possible. Well, I can tell you one big step is getting the examiners out of your hair, at least as far as CRA is concerned, is getting that confidence built up that this bank knows what it's doing, it's got its act together, and they're giving me information I can count on. Boy, that is so important in winning over an examiner's attitude as well as confidence, which goes a long way towards getting them through the exam and getting a favorable result. The fifth thing that's a CRA best practice is having your CRA assessment area delineated and reviewed every year and documented in writing. Because how you identify and configure your market, your assessment area is one of the most important decisions you're going to ever make in CRA. It has dramatic implications for your performance standards. And we yesterday just had a webinar just solely about that topic. It's that important. And showing the examiners that you understand that CRA is all about understanding and meeting the need for credit in your community. Well, that begins with studying and understanding your community in the first place and properly identifying it. I have seen hundreds of banks, and I would say an unbelievably high percentage of them do not take the assessment area delineation with the seriousness that it requires. Most bankers are just preoccupied with delineating their assessment area in a way that meets the technical requirements of the regulation, but don't give real thought to the significant implications that an assessment area has for a bank and its performance expectations. This is really critical. I think it's important. Even if you do not change your assessment area, you introduce in the board minutes that you've reviewed the assessment area and you've determined that it's proper for the bank given its strategy and given the market situation in which you're operating. That documenting that in writing, again, not only shows that you're paying attention to this stuff, it shows that the board is exercising its oversight. And when you're a community bank or a small bank, man, that is even more impressive because so few really go that extra mile to show these things. Number 6, you should definitely at least have an annual performance report to the board itself, and it should be documented in writing. If you follow those things and you show the examiners that you're doing these things as part of your process, don't wait for them to ask you the question. What you should do is proactively present it to them, and do that again without even being asked. Just say, look, we take great pride in having a well-established process in place that assures the integrity of our data, and our bank is serious about the CRA process here. That will go a long way to getting off to the right foot. Now, let's talk about the public file for a few minutes. The public file has to have the following contents. It has to have an up-to-date assessment area map or maps, if you have multiple assessment areas. It has to have a delineation of all the census tracts that are inside your assessment area. It must maintain the HMDA disclosure statements if you're a HMDA reporter for the last 2 years, and they should be filed in your public file within 30 days after they're issued by the regulators. And a little side comment here, it used to be that the disclosure statements were sent to you, but they are not any longer. They're announced that they're released, and they're on the FFIEC website, and it's your responsibility to go out and grab them and have them in your public file within 30 days. And that applies to the CRA disclosures as well, if you're a CRA reporting bank. You need to have in your public file any public comments and any responses that you've had with respect to those comments, as long as they pertain to your Community Reinvestment Act performance. In your public file also should be the public section of your latest CRA performance evaluation. Even if you're a small bank and it was 4 years ago, that needs to be in your public file. Next, you need to have a list of all the branches, including their addresses, their hours and days of operation, the services they offer, and any differences in service and pricing. After that, you should identify any branches that have been opened or closed in the last 2 years. And I make that the last 2 calendar years plus year to date and whatever year you're in. And number 9, you should have any loan data pertaining to any consumer loan portfolios that you voluntarily had included in your last performance evaluation. Now, that's a little elective that's involved in the exam that we always recommend to banks that they consider. The regulation allows you, and first of all, the regulation mandates that in your CRA performance evaluation, all small business loans, small farm loans, and any HMDA loans would be included in your exam. But it also gives banks the elective to include other portfolios if they collect and monitor and maintain the data in good order. So it's an elective which potentially could help out your performance, and you don't have to exercise if it turns out that the data don't help out your performance. So in my opinion, it's a no-brainer. It's something that every bank should be doing, is collecting the data on the consumer loans and other small business loans and monitoring it, and then making a decision when you're about to be examined as to whether you want to include it in your CRA performance evaluation. Now, I also want to call your attention, even though it's not on this list, something about the public notice. Every bank is required to have a public notice about CRA in its public lobby. The regulation doesn't specify the size of that notice, but we recommend a poster size notice, a standard poster size notice. It's got to be in the main office and in all the branch offices in the public lobby. And the content of that public notice can be found in the CRA guide. An exact copy of it can be found there. And all you need to do is just copy and paste that and just insert the name of your regulatory agencies in the public notice, and you'll be fine. And I can't emphasize that too much. One of the little things examiners do is they will walk through your public lobby and they will look at something like this. And it's one of those little dinky things that sometimes you forget about. Maybe there was a poster that was posted at one point in time, and when they painted the walls of the bank a year ago, somebody forgot to put it back up. But make certain that every branch in your main office has a CRA public notice posted in some conspicuous place, because it's embarrassing to get something like that, something as mechanical as that, cited as a failure on the part of the bank. Now, a couple of recommendations about your CRA public note, about your best practices for your public file. First of all, and this is not required by regulation, so very few banks do it, but we recommend it as a best practice. Number one, the CRA officer should insert an annual statement regarding the receipt or non-receipt of public comments in the public file. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, well, why should he do that? Well, the reason is this. And most of you, I can guarantee, if I could do a poll right now, I'll bet 99% of you, in fact, the ivory soap percentage of you, 99.44%, have never had a public comment received about CRA. And you're saying to yourselves, well, why should we post a statement saying we've not gotten a comment? Well, think about this. You're an examiner. You come in and you look at the public file, and you see there's nothing in it regarding public comments. How do you know that there have been public comments received that the CRA officer forgot to put in the file, or just didn't know enough to put in the file in the first place? You make their job easier, and you show that you're on top of your game when you put a statement in your public file saying that no public comments about CRA have been received in the last year, and that therefore there are no comments in the public file. Boy, do you make yourself look good, and you make the examiner's job easier. And what happens when the examiner's job is made easier? Guess what? They start having a much more favorable opinion of you. Also, let's face it, examiners don't want to work any harder than anybody else. Why should you make them ask the very obvious? So you basically make their job easier by doing this, and you win them over. And you want to win over, like anything else in life. When you're dealing with someone who's making an important decision about you, you want to win them over. You want them to root for you, to want to give you a good performance evaluation. And you can do that by making their job easier. On the other hand, if you're one of those banks where every time an examiner asks you a question, it's like pulling teeth and it's a Keystone Cops drill going on, you make their job a lot harder, and guess what it does to their attitude about you? So, number one, we recommend, even though you don't have to do this, that you do this and sign it and date it as of April 1st of each year. And I say April 1st not because it's April Fool's Day. I say it because that's the date the regulation cites that your data is supposed to be posted and updated every year. In addition, we recommend that you should include a statement from the CRA officer confirming that he or she has reviewed the public file and it is complete and accurate and dated April 1st every year. Again, this is not required in the regulation, and you will not be cited if you do not do it. But my job as an advisor to banks is to advise you on what is going to make your job easier and what's going to show to examiners that you're doing your job and what's going to get you a performance evaluation of satisfactory or better. And when you start doing these little things, they can add up to a big positive impression that makes it a lot easier to get that big S that you want to get, the satisfactory performance rating that gets you through, so you can go and worry about something else, like safety and soundness or whatever other responsibilities you have. My job is to help you get rid of your CRA problems and anxieties so you can worry about other issues. Now, let's talk about data preparation and data integrity. Let me begin. There are approximately 100 people registered for this webinar, and almost half of you are identified as small banks, and a third of you are intermediate small banks. So that means basically 80-some-odd% of you, 4 and 5 of you, don't have the responsibility to report under the regulation. But all of you have the responsibility to perform under the regulation. And in my opinion, any bank that does not collect its CRA data and follow it, it's got to have a death wish, because you're going to be evaluated on the data whether you know it or not and whether you like it or not. And I don't know about you, but I like to have some control over my fate and destiny, and I can't control my fate and destiny if the information that's being used to judge my fate and destiny, I don't even know what it is. So it's a big mistake if you're a small bank and you aren't collecting and monitoring this data, even if you're not reporting it. Now, what will happen is if you're not collecting and monitoring the data and managing it in a way that the examiners have confidence that it's reliable, they're going to go in and they're going to do a sampling of your data. Now, the problem with a sampling is it may or may not be accurate. Sure, they're going to use scientific sampling techniques, which are supposed to be accurate, but you really don't know, particularly if you have just a small number of loans. In fact, data sampling techniques are notoriously inaccurate when the universe is rather small, because you can get a wide variation of responses. So they're going to go in and do a sampling, and then based on that sampling, they're going to tell you how you're performing. Now, the problem is this: if it looks bad, you don't have any information to respond to and say, no, you're wrong. And moreover, think about this, how insane this is. If they're wrong, you wouldn't even know they were wrong, because you wouldn't have the data to be able to rebut what they're saying. So if you have not collected the data, please, in preparation for your exam, go out and get the data. Most of you small banks, when we're talking about CRA, you probably do fewer than 100 loans a year. That would be small business loans. So it's not like going out and collecting thousands of records. But I can tell you right now, if you don't do this, you've just lost control of your fate, and you will have no idea of what questions the examiners are going to have and how to respond to them. You're going to be like a doe in the headlights when they start asking you those tough questions about your performance when you didn't have a clue about any of these things. So drop everything and start collecting that data in preparation for your exam. You can do it in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. If you don't have the software to map out or to spread the data out, the FFIEC CRA software is pretty good software, actually. And you can use it as a data entry point, or you can use it to import data in. You can import data in the form of an Excel spreadsheet into your FFIEC free software. In addition to that, there are some very good commercial packages out there, which I would recommend, but I'm not going to say anything specific about that in this webinar. But nonetheless, you owe it to yourself and you owe it to your bank to get control of your destiny and to get this data. Then you want to go through and you want to make certain that the data is accurate and reliable. So if you've been collecting the data, you want to show the examiners that you've gone through an edit checking process, that they can count on it. If you have good commercial software, in fact, I believe actually the FFIEC software has some edit checking capabilities in it too. So whenever you edit your data, keep the results, even if it shows problems. Because again, the examiners know that you're not infallible. What they want to know is, do you have a process or procedure in place to recognize data errors, and do you correct them? Or you just sloppily collect the data, don't even care, and you just enter anything in, even wrong codes that are even non-existent codes for certain loan fields, and that's the way it is. No, you want to show them that they should have confidence in what you're doing. So show them your edit check procedures. Shove it in their faces, even if they're not asking for it, saying, look, here's what we're doing to assure the integrity of the data. And if you have an internal auditor or anyone involved in reviewing the data, show them those results, document those results. Now, an important point of data preparation integrity is, believe it or not, is the very end of it. It's actually reviewing the data and monitoring it. You may go through a process of collecting the data and scrubbing it and everything else, but there still can be problems in your data that are not obvious until you start analyzing it. When you see some weird loan pattern develop. This happened a few years ago with a client of ours where the woman who was responsible for collecting the data got seriously ill. She had to take a leave of absence from the bank, and in her place, someone was entering the data who didn't have as complete an understanding of the CRA codes as she did. And as a result, there was problems in their data that no one recognized. They uploaded their data to us for analysis. We went through this unbelievably detailed analysis and presented the results to management. And when everybody looked at the numbers, everybody said, wow, this is weird. There's some weird results here. And that provoked a further examination of the records. And it turned out that the person who was coding the loans omitted all loans to businesses that had over $1 million of gross annual revenue. They thought a small business loan was based on the size of the business and its annual revenues, not the size of the loan. And as a result, they omitted hundreds of loans that they should have included in the data. Now all the data that was recorded was perfect. It was fine. But the data that was omitted was never caught in a data scrub or edit because it wasn't there to be caught. The review of the data actually is what revealed it. So actually examining and analyzing your performance is a critical part of data integrity issues. So that means you have to review the data. You should be computing your performance results, and then not just computing them, but then reviewing the performance and having that documented. That itself will assure that you have a reliable database for the examiners to work on, and that you yourself know. Now, I'm going to recommend a few best practices here, one I've already basically talked about. If you haven't collected and compiled your HMDA and CRA loan data, try to do so for examination purposes. Get the FFIEC free software and then export it into you can either do it reverse, or you can collect the data in an Excel spreadsheet and import it into the FFIEC software, or you can do the data entry into the FFIEC software and export that into an Excel spreadsheet. But it gives you the means to organize your data the way it's supposed to be organized for CRA purposes. Another best practice I strongly recommend, and it'll blow the socks off of examiners if they see you're doing it, is you take and you reconcile the loan records that you've identified as small business loans for CRA purposes to the call report. And I say the call report journal, not the call report. The reason is that the call report itself is a snapshot in time. It just represents loans that are outstanding. What you want to do is you want to identify all the loans you've determined are small business loans, and you want to compare it to the call report record or report that compiles all the loans you originated during the year and how they're coded, because your bank has to identify small business loans in the call report, and there's a special code. So the chief financial officer of the bank, the controller of the bank, usually maintains that information, and I recommend that you go and you grab that information and you do a comparison with your records to see if there's an agreement or not. And if there isn't, then what you do is you figure out who's right and who's wrong. If you do that, that's going to put you up in the top 2% of banks in the country as a practice. It's going to wow the examiners that you're doing that, and it's going to spare you the embarrassment potentially if you've coded a loan one way and your chief financial officer's office coded it another way. There's nothing more embarrassing than to have a disagreement within the bank, and it creates the impression that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So a good practice, a best practice, which is not required, but we recommend, is to go through that reconciliation process every year. We do also recommend that you have some kind of internal audit or review of your CRA data and HMDA data at least once per year. This involves somebody going in and looking at the electronic records that you've got and comparing the data entry to what's in this file itself. to make certain that there's an agreement and that it's been done completely and accurately. And again, I want to say to you, even if the examiners don't ask for this stuff, let them know you've got it. You've got a folder ready to show them. Boast about it. Brag about it, because it is a good thing to do. Show them that you've gone that extra mile to assure the reliability of data. The next best practice we recommend is to monitor your activity and watch for trends. And document your monitoring of your data. You know, all of you are familiar with that old saying about real estate, how there's 3 important things with respect to real estate: location, location, and location. Well, when it comes to CRA and it comes to compliance, there's a similar saying, and it's documentation, documentation, documentation. You can never have too much documentation. We also recommend that every 5 years or so, you have an independent review of your systems and procedures. Someone from outside the bank should be looking to just determine whether things have changed over the years, and maybe you need a change in your systems and procedures, and it hasn't been reflected in your systems and procedures documents. That, again, is something that would wow examiners and would show them that this bank has really got its act together. Do everything that you possibly can to demonstrate that you've developed a reliable and complete database of information. It makes the examiner's job easier, and it's going to make your job easier. And it's going to enhance your potential for passing through your CRA exam with a minimum of headaches and a maximum likelihood of passing the exam. Now, as you all know, there are examination standards that are applied to banks based on their size. There are small banks, there are intermediate small banks, and there are large banks. You've got to know which examination standards are going to be applied for your exam. And in effect, and they're actually announced in the letter of advising you of the exam being imminent. For those of you who have voluntarily filed your data, who are intermediate small banks, the EIC will ask you if you want to be examined under the large bank standards as opposed to the intermediate small bank standards. And in many cases, that can benefit you. I'm not going to explain that today and why that is so, but we always recommend that banks that are not mandated to file their information seriously consider doing so, particularly if you're an intermediate small bank, because we believe that the examination standards applied to large banks are actually easier to pass than the examination standards applied to intermediate small banks. But in any event, the message is know what examination standard is going to be applied to your bank and know what that standard means. So let's take a look at that. Excuse me, I grab a little drink of water. Okay. There's basically the lending test, there's community development activities, and there's services. Now, every bank, no matter what your size, is subject to the lending test. And for all intents and purposes, the lending tests are substantially similar, if not identical. They all involve certain things, and we're going to go over that. So basically, every bank has got to be focused on the lending test. If you're an intermediate small bank or a large bank, you have to show community development lending, community development investing, and community development services. And if you're a large bank, you have a services test as well. But just, again, to emphasize, CRA, for the most part, is all about lending. It's all about, in the regulation, it talks about, quote, meeting the need for credit services in the community, end quote. That means lending, folks, lending 101. And the truth is, no matter what size bank you are, you have to pass the lending test to get a composite performance evaluation of satisfactory or better. Therefore, you've got to know what's involved in the lending test, no matter how big you are. You've got to know what the tests are. You have to know what the standards are. And you should know how you're performing. So let's do a quick review of that. When we talk about the CRA lending test, we're talking about the following specific items. The assessment area ratio. That means the percentage of your loans inside versus outside your assessment area. This is really a big part of the test. And in fact, if you fail this, if you don't show at least 50% of your lending is going on inside your assessment area, your probability of failing the exam has increased dramatically. I would say it's increased to a 90% chance or better that you're going to fail your exam. So number one, you need to know the assessment ratio, area ratio, what percentage of loans are inside, outside. Then you need to, they'll be looking at gap analysis. They're happy that you've done a certain amount of loans inside your assessment area. And the next question is the bank distributing its lending throughout its assessment area, or are there gaps in lending that reflect a failure on the part of the bank to provide credit in those neighborhoods and those areas? That's called gap analysis, and it deals with the geographic distribution of your loans inside the assessment area. You have to know these things. I can't believe how many CRA officers I've talked to who really don't know what the tests are in a CRA exam. And we have webinars that deal just with this stuff that could go on for 2 hours. But I'm just trying to highlight them here to help all of you as you get prepared for your CRA exam. The third thing is they'll look at what are called the penetration rates in low and moderate income tracts. And they calculate that by taking the relative number of your loans and the relative dollar value of your loans and dividing it by all the loans inside your assessment area that you did and all the dollar value of those loans inside your assessment area. So you need to know what that test is, and you need to be able to calculate that, and that's the methodology for that. Then they look at borrower characteristics, and they compute a penetration rate for that. Borrower characteristics, they mean the income classification of borrowers. And again, the focus, like it is for all of CRA, is on low and moderate income people. So they'll look at your mortgages and what percentages were extended to low mod people, calculated based on units and dollars, and they'll compare that to the standards. If you voluntarily include your consumer loans, which we strongly recommend if you do any significant amount of consumer lending, then they'll do the same thing for that as well. So you need to know that that's what's going to be done, and you have to do it yourself in advance if you're prudent and smart. Now, small banks and intermediate small banks, they also look at your loan-to-deposit ratio. And believe it or not, this has been a cause of banks failing their CRA exams in the last year in particular, it seems like. There's been a few prominent cases that have come even into the national media. There was a bank up in Boston and a bank in Pittsburgh who in every way looked good under CRA in many ways, but with respect to the loan-deposit ratio, they had low loan-to-deposit ratios. And they failed their CRA exam primarily because they had a low loan-to-deposit ratio, and the examiners felt that they weren't doing enough lending inside their assessment area. Now, pick up your pens and pencils and write this down. I'm going to give you a very good bonus recommendation about this. If you think you have an issue with respect to your loan-to-deposit ratio, what you should do is go into the summary of deposits data. Grab the summary of deposits data for your market and look at and see how your bank is ranked in terms of the deposit market share and deposit rank. And that is in the examiner manuals. When they talk about the adequacy of bank lending and determining that adequacy, in the examiner manuals, they talk about resorting to the SOD, the summary of deposits data, and looking at that as a benchmark to determine if the bank's doing enough lending. We have a client right now that failed its CRA exam because of this issue. They weren't a client of ours when they failed it, but they brought us in, and we're looking at it. And we did two things which I think are going to dramatically enhance their chance of getting out of the regulatory doghouse and with respect to this issue. And number one is we recommended that they expand their assessment area because we didn't think it was properly defined to begin with. And remember what I said about how critical that is? It has big, important implications for your, not only to be technically compliant, but in terms of your performance standards. So we recommended, number one, that they adjust and expand their assessment area. And then we recommended that they take a look at their summary of deposits data to see how they look. And it turns out that by expanding their assessment area, they not only increased the volume of lending that they're doing inside their assessment area, but at the same time, they actually lowered their market share as far as the deposit data was concerned. So they did two really good things simultaneously. They increased their numbers and their results, and they simultaneously decreased the performance standard that is being used to measure their performance. So as a result, we think they have a much better chance of passing their CRA exam. So that's a little tip that you should write down and take a look at. Now, community development lending is important for those of you who are ISBs and for those of you who are large banks. You've got to know how much community development lending you're doing, and you have to know what community development means under CRA. Finally, and this is another little tip, flexible and innovative loan programs can go a long way towards winning you brownie points in an exam. Those are programs that are non-traditional lending programs. A first-time homebuyers program falls into that category. Believe it or not, the SBA loan programs fall into that category. So if you have any loan programs that you think are flexible and innovative, then you ought to compile the information about that, and you ought to present it to examiners for consideration. SBA 7A, SBA 504 loans, the first-time homebuyers programs, etc. Don't be passive. Remember, the key to passing your exam and doing well is being proactive. Good CRA performance isn't something that happens. It's something you make happen. So the flexible and innovative programs can be a nice little bonus for you during an exam. The service test itself, which is what large banks are basically based on, believe it or not, is largely based on the distribution of your branch network among the geographies in your assessment area. And what they do is they look at how many of your branches are in the low, moderate income tracts, and they'll calculate the population in those tracts, and then they'll calculate a percentage that that population is of the entire assessment area. So that if, let's say, 25% of the population in your assessment area is in the LMI tracts, but 15% of your branches are in the LMI tracts, that is not a good comparison, but that's the way they calculate it. So be aware, if you're a large bank participating in this webinar today, that they're going to do that, and you ought to, number one, be aware of that, and number two, here's a little tip for you, a best practice. If you've got a branch that's not in a low mod tract, but is on the border with a low mod tract and services a population in the low mod tract, if I were you, I'd collect the data on the deposit distribution in that branch to show the regulators that even though the branch is not located in a low mod area, it's servicing the population in that low mod area. Moving along, community development means community development loans, community development services, and community development investments. For those of you who are intermediate small banks, this is super duper duper important. You have to have sufficient community development activity, which means that you've got to know what community development is and how it's uniquely defined in the regulation, and you've got to collect the data. I don't care whether you're required to or not. It's totally insane if you do not collect the data, because you could fail your exam for lack of that. And the examiners are not going to go out and find the loans for you. That's another little Len Suzio tidbit. The examiners can be nice people, and there can be some tough people, but even the nice people don't necessarily go out of their way to do your job for you. You are the one who's got the responsibility to show them that you're doing this stuff. So you have to show them that you're doing multifamily affordable housing, or the lending you're doing for community services. You have to show them that you're doing loans that create jobs or that revitalize low and mod areas. And as usual, I'm my talkative self, and I know I'm running past the time that we have scheduled here as far as my presentation, which may cut us short on some of the questions. So I'm going to accelerate a little bit. All right, CRA performance standards. This is really, really, really important. You know the CRA test. We just went over the CRA test. But the problem is that unless you know what the performance context is, you don't know the performance standards. So you can go in and you can calculate your penetration rate in your assessment area low, moderate income geographies. But unless you know what the standard is that the regulators are going to use, you don't know whether your results are good or bad or indifferent. In order to do that, you have to understand performance context. There was a post on Bankers Online this morning about this, and somebody was asking the question about how often they should review performance context. In my opinion, you have to monitor it continuously, but at least once a year. You have to know what they mean by performance context, and you have to go out and get this information. And by the way, best practice, if you collect this information, make it available to the examiner. Again, it'll show him or her that you know what you're doing. It's going to make their job easier, because you've got to be prepared to tell your story, and the performance context is a vital part of that story. Every conference I've ever gone to with examiners and regulators, they always say, be prepared to tell your story. Well, your story is largely predicated on the community you're in and the performance context that's derived from that community. That means the credit markets, the mortgages are extended in that community. It means the small business loans are extended in that community. It means the local demographics, and it means your bank's resources, its history, and its business strategy. So you need to go out and grab that information and have it ready. Best practice, be prepared to tell your story. That means you go out and you collect the performance context information, you have a file on it, and you show it to the examiners. So you have all the locally reported HMDA mortgage data activity and all the locally reported CRA loan data activity. You collect your local demographic information, and you collect information about your bank's resources, history, and strategy. So, for example, if your bank is not lending mortgages, consumer mortgages, because your focus is totally on the small business market, that's great. That's a legitimate business strategy. But the examiners have got to understand that. So when they see that you're not doing any mortgage lending, they understand that that's not part of your bank's business strategy, that your bank is meeting the need for credit services in the community by its small business lending activity. Don't assume that they're going to know that. You have to put this together, and you should have a file on performance context and break it out into the loan market data, into the demographic data, and into your bank's resources, history, and business strategy. Prepare a performance context package for your examiner. And by the way, make certain you're familiar with the information. Don't just collect a lot of information and not be familiar with it. You've got to know it and be able to use it and explain to the examiner how to use it, how you've used it. So to summarize, if you're serious about your CRA exam and you want to get through it as quickly as possible, you should be proactive. Know your performance before the examiners arrive. That means not only know your internal numbers and do your internal calculations, but it means getting that performance context data that we just talked about. Number 2, be organized and prepared. Don't be surprised. So, we covered your public file and what the content is there. We told you about some best practices for that. We talked to you about the importance of having a process that's organized and documented. Remember, documentation, documentation, documentation. We talk about data integrity and how examiners really are worried about that stuff. And any bank that goes out of the way to show them that they've got the data integrity is really going to go a long way towards getting through that exam fast as possible. Compute your performance under the different CRA tests. But don't stop there. Just don't go out and calculate your penetration rates, for example. You've then got to go to the next step, which is get the performance context data and compare your results to the market-driven performance standards. So that if you've got 15% of your mortgages in the low mod tracks, that's halfway there. But you got to know what the market is telling you. And if the market's telling you in your market 25% of the mortgages are in the LMI tracks, you've got a problem. And you better know it in advance, and you better be able to explain it to the regulators. But if you don't even know that, when they ask you the tough question, gee, you have 15% of your loans in the LMI tracks, but the market has got 25%, you're not going to have an explanation because you're not even going to be aware if that's the problem. And think about the impression that creates on an examiner. Would an examiner that hears a bank that's clueless about their performance believe that that bank's seriously committed to its CRA responsibilities or not? And what happens when they come to the conclusion that you're not? Are they going to give you the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the close calls? No. So be on top of your game. Be ready by having the performance context in these calculations. Rate your performance before the examiners do. When they come in, it should not be that they're telling you how you're performing. It should be the other way around. You're telling them how you're performing. You've already rated your performance, and you can explain why you've rated it the way you've done. And you know what? Best practice. Don't be afraid to admit if you have a problem somewhere. If you have a problem, acknowledge it, and then develop a plan of action to do something about it. That itself is another webinar entirely on its own. But they'll respect you. If they're looking at your performance, there's an obvious problem, and you've identified it already, and you've adopted a game plan about it, they're never going to criticize you for that. They're going to respect you for it, and they're going to have even more confidence that you're doing a rigorous and honest job of evaluating your performance, and they can count on your own analysis. And finally, be prepared to tell your story. Absolutely the most important thing. Every conference I've ever gone to is be prepared to tell your story. The examiners can look at the numbers, but they don't. All they know is they see the results. They don't know necessarily what are the dynamics behind the numbers. That's your job to explain it to them. And if you do it, you've made your job easier, you've made their job easier, you've enhanced your credibility, and you've just augmented the chances that you're going to get through your examination quickly, easily, and you're going to pass your exam. So, boy, I guess I went a little beyond. In fact, we're just coming up on the 60-minute area. I see a number of questions in here. What we're going to do is I'm only going to be able to answer maybe one or two questions because we're really at the end of the webinar. So I'll assure you of this. Any questions that we've got from the audience, we will send out an email to you within the next 5 days with publishing every question that we've got and giving you our answer. So don't be frustrated if I don't give you the answer today. In fact, I'm probably going to got time for just one question, but we will publish the results next week and then give you all an answer. So you'll not only have the answer to your own question, you'll be able to see what other questions came from other people. Now, one of the questions I see being asked frequently is about the availability of the slides. These slides are available to you. They were in the link that was sent to you for today's webinar that you should have received yesterday. If you do not find that email or you don't have the link, email us and we will send you the slide copies for your records. Because as I said a few minutes ago, you not only should have to be trained, you have to document that you've been trained, and this is a good thing to do. We've actually gone past the hour right now, so I have to conclude today's webinar without going into further questions. But again, I will reassure you, every single one of you will get copies of all the questions and the answers to them that all of you are asking. I want to thank all of you for giving us the opportunity to make this presentation. If any of you need help in preparing for your exam beyond this, certainly feel free to contact us. We'll be happy to. We've worked with hundreds of banks all over the country in terms of helping them prepare for their examinations and making it, I can't say an enjoyable process, because going through an exam is never an enjoyable process, but reducing the trauma and increasing the likelihood that you're going to succeed with the minimum of aggravation. On behalf of my staff, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. We hope you found it enjoyable and informative, and we look forward to having you participate in future GeoDataVision webinars. Thank you and have a great day.